The Tony Hawk series has been both critically praised and hated. It's had some of the best-selling games of its time and some of the worst. But for a while, it had a stranglehold on the market and was the extreme sports game of its day. The series was huge, skyrocketing the already increasing popularity of skateboarding to new heights. The earlier games managed to nail the style and aesthetic of a good skateboarding game, while actually having smooth and fun gameplay to accompany it. But that wouldn't always be true. The series would eventually hit a point where nothing was working anymore, where the games just weren't selling the same, and the series began to flounder, trying anything it could to keep the relevancy of that name. That's what I want to explore today. I'll be talking about every Tony Hawk game in the series and reviewing gameplay, mechanics, story, where possible, and everything in between. I do first want to note that there were some games that I will not be talking about in this video. I first will not be talking about every port or version of each of these games. It was very common for a lot of these games to release on just about every single console that was available at the time. Last generation, current generation, Game Boy Advance, DS, you name it. The ports are all drastically different from each other, but I did try to keep my discussion to only the prominent version of the game at the time. I also will not be talking about the mobile games Vert and Skate Jam. I tried to emulate both of these and they were hit or miss. Even when I did get them working though, there wasn't much there to be said. Hey there, it's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to talk about Tony Hawk games. In 1998, with the popularity of skateboarding on the rise and the success of two previous skateboarding games, Top Skater and Street Skater, Activision had set their eyes on the skateboarding genre. Neversoft was selected to develop the first game in this less-than-charted territory. This would be the fourth game under their belt after Skeleton Warriors, MDK, and Apocalypse. Tony Hawk's name was eventually attached to the game, as his popularity had been incredibly high in the skateboarding community. But it wasn't just his name that the game used. He also played early builds of the game and gave the team feedback on some of the mechanics. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was released for the PlayStation 1 on September 29, 1999 in North America and October 18, 1999 in the EU. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, at its simplest, is a game about skating around different areas and trying to get the highest score possible, but it's a little more complicated than that. First of all, the control scheme is very simple, especially with the first entry in the series. The D-pad is used to control our board, while holding down the X button and then releasing it will allow us to pop in the air with an ollie. When in the air, we can press the square button and a combination of different D-pad buttons to perform flip tricks. We can do the same thing with circle to perform grab tricks. Pressing triangle while landing towards a railing will allow us to grind the railing, and adding a press of one of the directional pad buttons will change the grind that we perform. Special tricks can also be completed by pressing specific D-pad combinations before pressing a specific face button. All special tricks are different, but our special meter must be full before using these, which can be filled by pulling off tricks and combos. Stringing tricks together without landing flat on the ground will result in a combo. Each trick has an associated score, and each trick adds 1 to the multiplier of the combo. Combos can be pulled off by grinding on multiple rails in a row, using vert ramps to string together tricks or grabs, and finding long lines to facilitate us getting large combinations. This stays true for mostly the entire series. The bare bones of the gameplay is generally the same across most of the entries, each just adding either expanded levels, different skaters, different modes of play, or new mechanics that make the game flow better. But because this was the beginning of the series, things are very minimal here. And that's most of Pro Skater's failing, is that it's just so early. I can't fault it too much because the developers really never knew how successful the game would actually be, and with a year's worth of development time, they did an incredible job. Each game also has a story and career mode. We don't just run around and try to get big combos, we also have to complete objectives in each level on a timer to earn tapes. Completing these objectives will unlock more levels moving forward. In the first game, there are 5 objectives per level. generally a high score goal requiring us to hit a certain score within the time limit, and a pro score goal requiring us to hit an even higher score within the time limit. Each level also has a skate goal, where we have to collect the letters that spell out the word skate that are hidden around the map. And lastly, each level generally has a hidden tape that is a bit more difficult to access. The last goal is usually level specific. For example, in the warehouse we have to smash 5 boxes, and in the school we have to grind 5 tables. These goals are generally pretty engaging and fun to cross off the list. Completing these goals also gives us a natural way to discover the way that each level works, and the lines that are included in the level. Each level is designed with a ton of different places to trick off of and get big scores. Some of these are just vert ramps placed against walls, strings of rails that allow us to get big grind combos, or just a spot where we can get some massive air. These lines are pretty important in the design of any Pro Skater level, and their inclusion determines whether a level is fun to play or not. In between the larger, more open levels that have goals for us to complete, there are also competition levels. These are generally smaller and require us to compete in a skating league to try and get the gold medal. We get 3 runs total, and each of those runs are scored based on the tricks that we do and the combos that we pull off. We get scored on these 3 runs, and then the best 2 runs are actually scored. We're then placed based on those final 2 scores. The game has 9 levels in total and 12 skaters, with 10 of those being pro skaters and 2 being secret unlockable characters. So, I'm not a massive fan of the first Tony Hawk game, and maybe this comes from the fact that I don't have a ton of nostalgia surrounding it. This was one of the only games in the series that I didn't play when I was younger, but revisiting this game in the modern day, especially with the knowledge of where the series would go, you can tell that the rust of time has not been kind to this entry. The controls are pretty clunky, and the game is overall very floaty. This means that there isn't a ton of weight to the game, so it doesn't feel exactly that real. Not that this is what the series was going for at all. The Tony Hawk games were all designed around the idea of being way more arcadey than an actual realistic skate sim. But the game just feels a bit frustrating to play, and I can explain why. The introduction of the manual feature would not pop its head up until the next entry in the series, and because of that, it becomes pretty difficult to string together combos. In the later games, the manual will become our bread and butter, aside from grinds and other tricks. It's a vehicle to get to other pieces of hardware that we can trick on without landing and touching the ground, keeping our combo going. But in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, that really isn't there, and this job is filled by the wall ride. And this is fine in theory, but it causes some issues, because then our focus is generally on the outside of the map. It's also a little more difficult to pull off than manualing on the ground. Sure, there's a higher skill ceiling here, so that might be interesting for the people that really want to dive in the weeds and get good, but for me, it just wasn't really that intriguing. I will say that it is incredibly easy to see why this game was successful for the time though. Forgetting about the absolute void in the market for this type of game, Pro Skater has a lot going for it. The aesthetics are fantastic, everything has a really distinct style and is well designed, the soundtrack has a ton of great songs that perfectly fit the vibe that the game was going for. It totally makes sense, and giving people a skateboarding game that they can just go crazy with and spend tons of hours racking up huge combos was exactly what people wanted at the time. And the Pro Skater series would have incredible highs and really low lows, but this was only the beginning. The first Pro Skater game was incredibly successful, selling 3.5 million units in the first 2 years of its release, but the next entry in the series is where the games would truly start to hit their stride. Before the first Pro Skater game released, Neversoft was already developing a sequel. Shortly after the release of the first game, Neversoft was also acquired by Activision. And while the second game in the series does look very similar to the first, it would introduce a lot of things that would become staples for the series. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was released for PlayStation 1 on September 19, 2000 in North America and September 29, 2000 in the EU. Most of Pro Skater 2 is very similar to the first game. We have a main career mode with goals, competition levels in between, and we can trick, grind, and grab our way to higher scores. The biggest introduction for the second game, though, comes in the form of manuals. A manual allows us to balance on the back or front set of wheels of our board. Because this is still a trick, we have not stopped our combo, meaning that we can use manuals to get from object to object and still continue our combo without landing on the ground. This drastically changes how we use each level and the ability to combo on each level. We're no longer confined to the outsides of the levels or just the spots with a few rails beside each other. As long as we have the ability and can pull off manualing from place to place, we can combo the entire level if we want. I'm not saying it wasn't possible before, but it's now much easier and way more attainable. Manualing just changes the entire game and adds a completely new set of tricks to our arsenal. On top of that, this game also introduced character customization, allowing us to play our own created skater and also create our own levels. The goals for each level have also been greatly expanded, upgraded from 5 in each area to 10. Each area now has 3 high score goals, each higher than the last. The skate goals and the secret tapes have also returned, and this time around each level has 4 level-specific objectives. Pro Skater also introduces a pretty important concept in that of cash. For each goal we complete, we get a certain amount of cash. We can also find money around the levels and pick it up. We can use this cash to buy new tricks or upgrade our skaters' skills. Skills are pretty important. In the first game, each skater had their own unique skill levels for how much air they could get, how well they could grind, etc. These were all based on the real skaters that you were playing and their real-life abilities. Now, those stats start out reflecting the skater that you're using, but you can use cash to increase those skill points until they're maxed out. This is incredibly new because, for example, getting your grind skill all the way to max makes it way easier to balance on rails over a long period of time. Or getting your spin increased all the way to max makes it way easier to turn in the air, pulling off larger tricks. There's also an extra goal for each level that we can only complete if we finish all the goals and gather all the cash in a level, virtually 100%ing it. Pro Skater 2 still has some of the issues that the first Pro Skater game had with the clunkiness of controls and just general moving around, but in almost every other area it makes valid upgrades for the series. The introduction of manuals is massive and would never leave the series from here on out. The expanded goals system was also huge, making us stay in each level for far longer than we might before. The game, in my opinion, also just looks a lot better with the upgraded engine. It's a bit more aesthetically pleasing, and the levels are more fun overall. I think that if you compare each level, sure, some of the first game's levels will beat out the second, but overall, I think the second game has the better roster. Levels like Venice Beach, School 2, and the Bull Ring are all iconic and have really good design. Objects that we can trick on have much better placement, allowing us for large gaps and long combos. The whole thing just feels really smooth aside from the slightly clunky controls. The other large thing that Pro Skater 2 introduces pretty subtly is the tone that the later games would take. If you know anything about the other entries in the series, you'll know that the Tony Hawk series gets pretty goofy with its comedy. Its general style sort of matches the time that it was released, this edgy, really light comedy that just permeates either the story, goals, or environment. Things like the goal in Venice Beach where we have to ollie the magic bum 5 times, a homeless person that can teleport around the area every time we ollie over him. It's probably one of the most notable parts of the series, and Pro Skater 2 was the first game that really introduces that. Overall, I think Pro Skater 2 is probably one of the best entries in the series. Of course, like Pro Skater, it's a little dated now, and I'd probably rather play some of the later entries over this one, but it's still really solid. Pro Skater 2 did even better than the first game in the series, becoming the highest selling PlayStation title for 2 weeks in a row. But the next game in the series would bring the Pro Skater games into the next generation of consoles. Following the pattern for the previous 2 games in the series, Pro Skater 3 would shoot for release the next year in 2001. The PlayStation 2 had already released by the time that the second game in the series came out, but Pro Skater 3 was meant for the next-gen consoles. But to capture both markets new and old, the game was released on both the PlayStation and the PlayStation 2 on October 30th, 2001 in the US and November 30th, 2001 in the EU. Pro Skater 3 is also very similar to the previous games in the series. The basic structure is the same, with levels, goals, tricks, and combos. The biggest introduction here in terms of mechanics, though, is the revert. Previously, it was a little difficult to pull off a grab trick in a vert ramp because if you land in the ramp, your combo is finished. But a revert allows us to land in the vert ramp and keep our combo going by turning our board around 180 degrees as we land on the ground. This is as simple as pressing the right trigger on the controller. Combining this with a manual directly after the revert allows us to get another object to trick on, like a rail, box, or another vert ramp. With this, we've effectively obtained the complete set of moves that Pro Skater would become known for, and this all makes Pro Skater's combo system even more complete. Pro Skater 3 feels incredibly good to trick, to combo, just to skate. It's probably my favorite of the actual mainline Pro Skater games. The game also introduces a ton of new skaters with a massive amount of secret skaters for us to unlock. Each time we complete all of the goals and all of the levels in the game with a specific skater, we unlock a new secret skater. These range from the very normal, like a mall cop, to the absolutely insane, like Darth Maul and Wolverine. I remember unlocking these when I was a kid, and it was easily the coolest thing in the game. Being able to skate around with these characters was such a treat for making it through the game. They all have their own special movesets as well, with special tricks that reflect the character we're actually playing. Pro Skater 3 has 12 levels total this time around, just in the PlayStation 2 version. Other versions would have specific exclusive levels for their platforms. I should also note here that with Pro Skater 3, the cash system was removed for skill points. We no longer have to collect cash and buy our skill points, we can just collect floating skill points from around the map. It's effectively the same thing, but we have to do far less to get the skill points. Instead of maybe having to complete 3 goals and picking up a couple of pieces of cash to get one of the later, more expensive skill points, we can just pick up one of these. I am in favor of this change, but I would probably lean towards the later entries in the series and the way that they would handle skill points overall. And Pro Skater 3 really bumps everything up a notch when it comes to that goofy comedy style as well. The absurdist humor is just at maximum in this entry, and it really reflects what the other games would look like in terms of style. Skating through the first level, the Foundry, will see us knocking people into vats to complete our objectives. And this is also the first game that introduces a ton of environment interaction. In Pro Skater 3, a lot of our goals will either have huge effects on the current environment or will unlock new areas for us to skate in. A perfect example of this is in the LA level, where we can crash cars by dislodging them from the overpass and cause a massive traffic jam. This changes the way that we skate the level and changes the layout of things. This is a huge part of the series for me, being able to change the levels because of the goals that we complete. Also, unlocking secret areas like the haunted house in Suburbia adds to this. It's just such a massive part of the game and the series. It makes the levels feel even more special because as we skate it and uncover where the lines are, we unlock completely new areas to incorporate into the existing level. And this also introduces the destruction aspect that the series is known for. This fits back into the style that Pro Skater is going for, skating above all else, getting the gaps, getting the grinds, getting the goals. And overall, Pro Skater 3 being on the PlayStation 2 has just made the game that much more responsive. It feels better to play, we have more control over our character, and the things we do really feel like our own choices and ability rather than the game. If we get a really good line or bail on something really heavy, then it feels either more satisfying or like something that we failed in. Pro Skater 3 is really one of my favorites in the series, and I played this game a ton as a kid. Certain levels like the Foundry in Canada have just stuck in my mind so much over the years that playing them again just felt like something I've done a million times before. And this all just speaks to the staying power that some of these games have. Years after their release, they don't leave the minds of those that have played them. The UI is far cleaner as well, the soundtrack is, in my opinion, even better than before, and everything is a lot more streamlined. I couldn't find concrete sales data for the third entry in the series, but it does seem like it sold somewhere in the similar range of the previous game, at least for the PlayStation 2 version. There's no telling how much the game sold though, with all of the ports included. Regardless, the game was still successful, and there was no stopping the Pro Skater series anytime soon. With the incredible success of the series so far, Neversoft had to change things up. They couldn't really just put out another game with new levels and more skaters. I mean, they could have, but it might have caused fatigue in the audience, especially with the games coming out so quickly, one after the other. Because of this, Pro Skater 4 became the game that would really shake things up, not just by adding in some new mechanics, but by changing the entire format. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 was released on GameCube, PlayStation, and Xbox simultaneously on October 23, 2002 in the US, November 15, 2002 in the EU, and it was later released on the PlayStation 2 on October 23, 2002 in North America. I played the PlayStation 2 version of the game just to keep things consistent, and it also seems like the best version of the game overall. A lot has changed in this entry in the series, and probably the largest change was getting rid of the 2-minute run system from the previous entries. In the first 3 games during career mode, we have 2 minutes to complete any goals and cross them off our checklist. If we want to complete any missed goals, we have to go for another run and try to get them again. Now, I will say that this does add some level of urgency to the areas, and being able to get all of the goals in one run is a true feat. But when you first start the game and don't know the levels very well, exploration over multiple runs is required. But with Pro Skater 4, we no longer are confined to 2-minute runs in each level. Instead, we are introduced to open levels with different NPCs or objectives placed all over the map, and it's our job to seek those out and complete them. These objectives themselves will have timers generally, so if we have to complete a combo, we might only have 2 minutes to do it. But there's no combo for the entire level. If we want to, we can just free skate around all the objectives and dip in and out of goals as we please. I think this adds a ton of convenience to the game and allows the career mode to be a lot more successful. There's nothing more frustrating than going for a 2-minute run and getting every letter of skate except for one, and the timer running out before you can get it, so now you have to do it all over again. I think the freedom of this just generally allows the player to approach things the way they'd actually like to, which is nice. Because of this open style, there's also a largely expanded goal set. In the last 2 games, we generally got around 10 goals per level, but this game has upgraded that list to 16. A lot of the most common goals return, like gathering skate or getting high scores, but there are a ton of other goals that are just level specific and completely random. Most of them are really good and add a ton of variety to the levels. I will say that Pro Skater 4 is probably one of the hardest games in the series, and it's not necessarily that hard to unlock all of the levels or just complete the game in its most basic form, but completing all of the challenges requires really putting in repeated attempts to put down the most stubborn of goals. Specifically, the manual challenges are really difficult, and these are usually hosted by Eric Costin. It got to the point where seeing Costin's name or face just filled me with rage. I now associate Eric Costin directly with pain. After completing a certain amount of the game, we'll also unlock pro challenges, which are different for every professional skater. These are actually really cool. The fact that each skater has their own variation is really nice and makes things feel personal, but these are also super difficult and will really test your patience. It definitely seems like Pro Skater 4 was trying to specifically target the more hardcore fans that were pretty familiar with the series. And honestly, I have no problem with that. I don't take away any points because a game is more difficult. If it's completely unfair and unbalanced, then I think that would add negative marks, but I don't see that from Pro Skater 4. Pro Skater 4 also added a ton of new mechanics that would change or expand the way we score points or pull off combos in the game. A lot of tricks are now changed if we double tap the associated face button when pulling it off. We can now level out in the air if we aren't even with the ground so we don't bail out. We can spine transfer from vert to vert. We can wall plant, power slide, and change our grinds or manuals mid-trick. Some of these were slightly implemented in Pro Skater 3, but Pro Skater 4 really fully brought them into the fold. There are some negatives in Pro Skater 4 though, it isn't all perfect. I think that one of the biggest downsides is that with such an expanded challenges list, and without the 2-minute run framework, we end up spending way more time in each level to complete all of the goals there. This results in a bit of a burnout by the time we reach the final levels of the game. In the first few games, completing all the goals and reaching the end makes you want to revisit some of the other levels and find the lines or gaps that you didn't stumble upon before. But here, it feels like you've spent double the amount of time in each level, and you're sort of tired of them by the end. It almost feels like a forced extension of the game completion time in some way. I doubt Neversoft specifically wanted to make the game longer so that fans felt like they got more bang for their buck, but it just feels like things are a bit more spread out. The other negative is that some of the levels just aren't that great. The previous 3 games seem to have a more even spread across levels when it comes to quality, but in Pro Skater 4 it feels like levels are either really good or not great at all. I can't say all the levels are bad because this game has places like Alcatraz or the Shipyard that just have tons of amazing lines and a general cohesiveness throughout the entire stage that feels so natural. But other levels definitely don't stand out as much, making the stages feel like a mixed bag across the board. I quite enjoyed Pro Skater 4 overall. I definitely didn't feel like it was perfect, and a lot of the parts didn't really click. Some of the adjustments and changes made to the formula were going in the right direction, but maybe went a little bit too far. But in the end, like the previous games in the series, I think it makes for a very fun and enjoyable experience. Pro Skater 4 sales dipped slightly, and at this point in the series, creating 4 games in 3 years may have burned some fans out a little bit. But Neversoft was ready to shake things up even more and change the series for the better. Tony Hawk's Underground was actually originally developed as Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5, but because the game ended up being so different in development, they decided to give it a different subname entirely. This game was meant to be bigger than the others, include a genuine story mode with a real plot, and even have full cutscenes with 3D graphics. Underground was set to be a massive step up for the series and a slight course correction into a different direction for the series. Tony Hawk's Underground was released for GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox on October 27, 2003 in North America and on November 21, 2003 in the EU. Like I said before, Underground would greatly change things up, hence the new title. This game is almost nothing like the original Pro Skater games outside of the general combo system. The game's main draw is its story mode, because this would be the first game in the series with an actual plotline, a genuine story with characters, cutscenes, and a narrative. The story revolves around our skater, one that we create and customize ourselves. I happen to particularly like the character creator in Underground because it's really good for making freaky looking dudes. You can mess with a few sliders and suddenly you've cooked up your own skating monster to send into the world. The character we create, though, is not a pro yet, not even an amateur, but he has big aspirations when it comes to skating. So does his best friend, Eric Sparrow. The game follows a plot as the two try to make their way together in the skating world, starting out in the humble streets of New Jersey, all the way to places like Moscow and Hawaii. Along the way, Sparrow turns out to be a massive traitor and earns his spot as one of the most hateable video game characters of all time, as he tries to take credit for everything that we do and gain spots that we actually earned. The story of Underground, even though it includes a lot of wacky elements of the previous 2 Tony Hawk games, is surprisingly grounded. It revolves around our character's aspirations and the betrayal from his friend, their separation, and inevitable rivalry. The game manages to create a villain that we actually dislike and want to root against, while also lifting our own character up. And we'll talk about the rest of Underground's story in a second, but the game also drastically expands on the open world elements from Pro Skater 4. The core layout of the game is pretty similar to Pro Skater 4. We have open levels to explore with different NPCs who will give us objectives to complete so that we can move on. But in comparison to Pro Skater 4, these objectives are far more focused on the theme of the level or the story in general. For example, in the starting area in New Jersey, we'll either have to work to impress the pros that are in town and try to get sponsored, or just help out the people around our neighborhood. This doesn't mean that the goals aren't crazy either. There are still things like sketching a dog's tail around New Jersey just to get him some exercise. The game hasn't lost that tone that the team was going for. The largest new actual mechanic that Underground introduces is probably getting off your board. Something I haven't mentioned in talking about previous games was how frustrating it can be to get to specific spots. And of course, the games were designed with this in mind. But in Underground, we can now just get off our board if we see somewhere particularly interesting to start a line, or some very nice vert ramp that we can spine transfer down from. We can also incorporate these into our combos. Let's say we have a great line, but it dead ends somewhere and we want to get to another object that might be kind of difficult to traverse to with manuals. We can just get off our board, and as long as we trick before the little timer on the screen runs out, then our combo still continues. This allows for a lot more freedom and diversity in the objects that we choose to trick on. Getting off your board just feels like something that should have always been there in the series, but maybe just wasn't possible yet. It just feels so natural to these games that its inclusion seems like a no-brainer. One of my favorite changes that the game makes is the removal of skill points. Instead of picking up floating objects, which, like I said before, was a temporary solution to the skill system, we actually level up our skills by completing objectives related to those skills. For example, to increase our grind skill, we might have to grind for 5 seconds uninterrupted. We can't increase our skills to max from the beginning though, because the later skill points are locked behind certain points of the story. But I think the system fits Underground perfectly. It matches the tone of the game, which is a skater working his way up in the ranks. We are slowly getting better, but we only get better by completing those actions that we want to get better at. Practice makes perfect after all. In some ways, the change to Underground's structure and format almost feels like it's 3/4 of the way to becoming a skateboarding RPG. And that's part of the reason that I love Underground so much. It just feels so much better to play because we feel like we're building someone, ourselves, from the ground up. Not to mention the fact that the combos, tricks, and mechanics at our disposal make actually scoring and skating feel better than ever. Everything is really fluid here, and most of the levels are really high quality. Great design with perfect lines looping around the entire area. The design is just totally perfected here. Like I said though, Underground is in no shortage of wacky moments, characters, or things to do. The game even introduces driving, and we use it for certain objectives and story missions. This is really just a cherry on top. I can't say the driving is actually really good at all. It honestly just feels like the same mechanics were used for skating, but instead of controlling a board, we're controlling a massive vehicle. But that doesn't really change the fact that things like this are fun, and only add to the experience of the game overall. But as we advance through the ranks and eventually get sponsored, get our own shoe, etc., our main character eventually learns the classic lesson that every protagonist from a 90s drama movie learns, that the things they wanted were right there from the beginning. So we end the game where we began, back at home in New Jersey. Our character decides to create his own skate team, and we pick the pros that we want on this team, as we complete one difficult objective with them each to create the ultimate skate video. The game just has such a simple but great script. It feels so wholesome and honestly genuinely does feel like it's a story that could be supplanted right into a feel-good blockbuster about skating. It's wonderful, it doesn't take itself too seriously, and that really makes Tony Hawk's Underground incredibly hard to beat as one of the best games in the series. It clearly did well in sales though, seemingly outselling Pro Skater 4 and indicating that this new direction for the series was probably the right one. With the success of Tony Hawk's Underground, it was a no-brainer that a sequel to this new subtitle in the series would be on the way. But this time around, the game would shed away that wholesome sort of charm and go full-on into the deep end of hijinks and destruction. Tony Hawk's Underground 2 was released for the PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Xbox on October 4th, 2004 in the US, and on October 8th, 2004 in the PAL region. Now, Underground 2 is almost nothing like Underground, and also somehow exactly like Underground at the same time. And honestly, it's my favorite game in the entire series. I'll just get that out of the way up front. And I'll be honest, a ton of this is nostalgia and bias, because there was another version of this game that was released for the PSP, called Underground 2 Remix, and it had additional levels, challenges, goals, etc. I played that game a ton. I would beat and rebeat Underground 2 Remix probably 30 times in the course of the few years that I was absolutely squeezing out every ounce of use from my PSP in middle school. It was easily one of my favorite games at the time, and a lot of that had to do with the era that skateboarding culture was in at that period. I'll explain more in a second, but let's take a look at Underground 2 first. Firstly, Underground 2 changes a lot to the format that the previous games set up. First of all, this is no longer a story about an up-and-coming skater climbing the ranks, it's now about the World Destruction Tour. Bam Margera and Tony Hawk are having a friendly competition. They're crafting 2 teams of skaters to take on a massive tour around the globe. These teams will complete different objectives, either pulling off huge tricks or destroying as many things as they can. Each of these objectives give the team points, and the team with the most points at the end wins. We, of course, are selected for Tony Hawk's team, and Bam's team is sort of set up as the villains of this entry. The story doesn't really get any more deep than this, it's mostly played for laughs throughout the game's runtime. The game really doesn't take itself seriously this time around and isn't trying to have you emotionally invested or anything. It's just there as an excuse for us to travel to these different places. In Underground, different levels usually reflected different things. When we needed to make a skate video, we headed to New York. When we needed to get a big clip, we headed to Hawaii. In Underground 2, we're heading to these different locations to complete checklists for our team. When we start the level, we will have our own personal checklist to complete. These goals are no longer triggered by running up to NPCs and starting a challenge. We just free roam around and try to complete them with the information that we're given. But our goals aren't the only ones that matter. In each level, we will also have a pro skater that we can find and play as, completing their unique list of goals, earning more points for the team, and 2 secret skaters that each have their own goals. The pro skaters function just like normal skaters, except they have their own skills and tricks. The special skaters are usually entirely different. In the case of the first level, Boston, we can play Jesse James, who rides around on some sort of bike/motorized Segway thing. They usually play entirely different to normal skaters and have their own sort of style and movesets. In Barcelona, we find Steve-O riding a mechanical bull and a skull demon man with a tricycle in New Orleans. We can jump off our board again, but now we can spray paint on walls, we can slap stickers on walls, we can throw things at people as long as we pick them up. The game overall just feels like it's built around finding these secrets. The entire structure feels like it prioritizes the special sort of feeling that Pro Skater 3 introduced when destroying levels and changing them around. The goals are more wild than ever as well. Opening the crypts in New Orleans summons a demon storm in the center of town with a hole directly into hell. Everyone in the town turns into zombies, and the only way to reverse this change is by grinding the chandelier in hell and then doing an airwalk over the statue in town to blast the demons back. The game just goes full 1000 into the other direction, pumping the ridiculous nature that was probably a bit more subtle in the first few entries up to 11. And a large part of this has to do with the style that the story takes as well. The reason, in my opinion, that the story is based around this worldwide scavenger hunt Bam Margera thing is that this was probably close to peak Bam Margera popularity at the time. The show Jackass ended in 2001, and the first movie had released in 2002. And if you aren't aware, Jackass, Bam Margera, and CKY are all inextricably linked to the skateboarding world. Bam's show, Viva La Bam, had just started a year before this game released and had already been a massive hit for MTV, so making a game that carried that same kind of tone, feeling, and weight was probably a ploy to try and capture those sorts of skating fans, or even just fans of this new offshoot of skating that was more set on destruction and bails than pulling off technical tricks. And as a kid at the time, I ate it up. But that doesn't mean that Underground 2 is just a soulless cash grab. The tricks and combos feel great, the levels are massive and incredibly intricate with a ton of ways to run them. The goals are some of the most satisfying in all the games, probably in large part due to the massive yellow pop-up that appears when we complete them, secretly activating some part of my pea brain and shooting dopamine into my system. But in the end, it just works so well. Add to this the sheer amount of characters, secrets, and replayability that this game had, and in my mind, it becomes an instant classic. There's also a really small change that the game makes to the skill system from Underground. Our skill point challenges are no longer locked behind certain points in the story. We can complete them all at any time. So as long as we have the right objects and the ability, we can just get our skill maxed out from the very beginning. I like this a lot more than the system in Underground because newer players naturally feel gated out from this since they probably can't pull this stuff off yet anyways, and veteran players are allowed to get into things faster because they know what they're doing. The system almost feels self-balancing in a way. It's not all nostalgia though, because this game was still a joy to revisit even today. This game also introduces the focus mode, which allows us to use our special meter to slow down time and really nail down our combo for even more precision. It's a small feature, but one that I think is really interesting and can be used in special situations when we're at the end of a really long combo and it becomes difficult to manage the rail or manual balance. It can also make some of the more difficult challenges a bit easier for people who don't have experience with the series. Underground 2 is probably one of the funnest games in the series, and I honestly don't think it's the best. I think there are definitely problems, and I personally would have enjoyed the series continue in the direction it had with Underground, with the story having a little bit more weight and sincerity, but honestly, it'll always be my favorite at the end of the day. Despite it being my favorite, the game did not do as well as Underground, leading the team to once again rethink the direction of the series. With the declining sales of the Tony Hawk series, Neversoft decided to go in a new direction with the next entry. This one would be more focused on interacting with the world and bringing back a more straightforward story. Tony Hawk's American Wasteland was released for GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox on October 18, 2005 in the US and October 28, 2005 in the EU. Tony Hawk's American Wasteland doesn't exactly change a lot for the series, but it does resemble something closer to Underground rather than Underground 2. We play a skater who is trying to make his way in the world of skating, but he's going to take a less orthodox approach than our character did previously. He isn't going to be trying to win competitions and prove himself, he's going to build a skate park. Shortly after we arrive in Hollywood, our skater is introduced to a group of skateboarding miscreants who all like to shred at a place called Skate Ranch. Skate Ranch is a broken down, dilapidated hunk of junk, barely being kept alive by the people that run it. So our job is to head out into the world and try to find new objects to bring into the skate park. That's the main hook of American Wasteland. And as a main hook, I think this works great. Most of the goals will see us either tricking on things to get them to break or just pushing them and destroying big set pieces so that they can be transported back to our park. These can range from small awnings that we can grind on to massive T-Rex heads that are transformed into broken and shattered vert ramps. And the way that all of these pieces are incorporated into Skate Ranch is really, really cool. You end up with a park that, over the course of the game, you actually created. You feel like you're building something from the ground up, and even though anyone with a copy of American Wasteland would have the same ranch as you, it still feels like your park at the end of the day. It's so damn cool and is one of the things that makes American Wasteland kind of underrated. But there are other aspects to the game that just don't really appeal to me as much. Some of the larger goals can feel a bit hand-holdy, like putting up a large piece of text in the world that says jump here or grind here doesn't exactly scream good design to me. Though I do think that the later missions that see us bombing out of an oil rig into a tunnel that connects us back to California, or dressing up as an alien to crash a Ferris wheel, are genuine highlights in the go big or go home style that the series had taken. It's the series' ability to bump things up a notch that has always kept it going. Bigger is better certainly has seemed to work for it so far. But other problems plague the game, like the incredibly drawn-out tutorial that is played over the course of far too many missions for me to care. I mean, you end up doing so many introductory quests that I really just wanted to be left alone to play the game. There's also some overt movie references and humor in this game that I just didn't really care for. I never really loved the humor of the Tony Hawk series. It didn't have me dying on the floor laughing, but it just felt like the style of the game rather than something that the game is trying to force on you. This game is a little bit more in your face and definitely a lot more pop culture influenced than something like Underground or Pro Skater 3. I should also note that most of the levels in the game are connected. There are some that are separated by hidden loading screens or that require you to take a bus to travel to, but quite a few of them are connected by these small transitional areas. This does make the game feel like a world rather than a collection of levels for probably the first time in the series, but it also creates these long sequences where you're skating very limited objects just to get to your goal. This can become tedious over time and doesn't feel like it gels well with the current system. There's also a mini game here where you can learn how to ride a BMX bike and complete tricks with that. It's actually pretty well designed, and completing these objectives feels like a nice way to break up the rest of the game. It was a small inclusion, but one that I enjoyed. And all of this sort of ends up leaving American Wasteland feeling like a mixed bag. I don't feel like it's a bad game at all, and I really do love the concept of Skate Ranch. Building your own park from the objectives you've completed is really fun. Giving players an in-game physical reward for completing missions is a fantastic way to incentivize engagement with the game. But a lot of the stuff around that just isn't really appealing enough to warrant putting this game in the best of the best. American Wasteland would not sell very well at all and would sort of mark the beginning of the downfall of the series. Honestly, the good days are now behind us because it's all downhill from here. Tony Hawk's Downhill Jam is not a traditional Tony Hawk game in any way, shape, or form. It represents a total and complete departure of the previously created and established systems in the service of trying out a new one-off idea. Tony Hawk's Downhill Jam was released in 2006 for the most part. So this game was actually released for the DS, Game Boy Advance, Wii, and PlayStation 2. I ended up playing the PlayStation 2 version of the game for this video because I've heard that the Wii controls were mostly trash and difficult to interface with. Downhill Jam actually ditches the traditional system of completing goals and challenges for just doing downhill runs. The game seems to take inspiration from some of the original 2-minute run style stages like Downhill Jam and The Mall, stages where all of the action heads in one direction and we complete the goals we set out to along the way. There's honestly not a ton to say about this game because it really is a total one-off project. The goal here is really just to race other contestants to the bottom outside of some special stages where we have to make sure we hit gates along the way. It's a pretty straightforward kart racer type of game, just with skateboards, grinding, and flip tricks. We can still do all of the basic stuff except manual, and these scores will factor into increasing our boost meter, getting us more speed to get to the bottom faster. The levels are designed pretty well for the most part, with alternate paths and shortcuts that we can take. We can also punch pedestrians and our fellow racers to leave them in our dust. It's honestly not a bad game overall, and I didn't really expect to enjoy this one even a little bit. This was one of the few games that I never played when it was released, and it kind of surprised me. It wasn't something that I wanted to play for an extended period of time, but it was enjoyable to sit down for a few 30-minute sessions and crank out a couple races on these concrete slopes. Nothing shocking here, just some decent, well-designed fun. Downhill Jam was another failure in the series as it never really managed to tap into this new market that it was looking for. But the next game in the series would be looking to revisit the open world formula and bring things into the next generation once again. With the next game in the series, the team would seek to bring the Tony Hawk games back to their roots, but also into the future, but also somewhere in between. Tony Hawk's Project 8 was released for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and Xbox 360 on November 7, 2006 in the US, and for PlayStation 3 on November 21, 2006. I played the PS3 version of this game because this game was released cross-generation, and the previous generation versions of the game are severely downgraded, at least in terms of fidelity. That doesn't mean that the PS3 version of the game is without its issues, because boy, it has a lot, but it seems to be the version of the game that is at least the fullest in terms of content. Tony Hawk's Project 8 centers around our main character who, once again, is looking to literally climb the ranks of the skateboarding world. This time, this means that we have to climb to the top of the skater rankings by entering the top 8 skaters in the world, starting all the way at number 200, the bottom. We can climb these rankings in a variety of ways. Project 8 is probably the first game to have an entirely open world in the series, one that is fully connected. This doesn't just mean that we can roam levels freely, it means that the levels are all connected into one big area with no transitional areas. In this open world, there are a ton of missions, challenges, classic modes, etc., etc. Basically a bunch of waypoints that we can travel to complete various objectives. How well we complete these objectives will determine whether we achieve a amateur ranking, a pro ranking, or a sick ranking, and in turn will increase our ranking in the leaderboards. The best thing I can really say about Project 8 is that it does have a very free structure to it. You're sort of allowed to approach things the way that you want to, and that gives some level of agency to the player. There are just so many damn objectives that if you really like the grind trials or the classic objectives or the demos, then you can just focus on those for a while. A lot of the challenges are really short, like the spray paint objectives where you have to manual over a marker and try to get to the goal markers before bailing out or landing the manual. The same thing goes for getting air or grinding or wall riding. These things are all over and come in many different forms. There are objectives that we can complete that will put us in a classic 2-minute timer mode where we have to complete goals like collecting skate and combo and getting high scores. There are newer objectives where we have to use the nail the trick system. Nail the trick allows us to press both thumbsticks while we're in the air to go into a slow motion mode. Here we can use the thumbsticks to manipulate the board in the air and pull tricks or fully create our own new tricks. The objectives around this mechanic will usually see us trying to get a high score off of a certain object. Now, like I said, there's a massive variety here, and this isn't even talking about the main missions, which see us opening up new areas, filming tapes for our skater, or competing in competitions. There's just a huge amount to do, but in my opinion, Project 8 definitely favors quantity over quality. This is for a lot of reasons, but the main one is that Project 8 just really doesn't feel like it has any sort of cohesive focus. It has no idea what it really wants to be. Is it trying to be the classic Tony Hawk games of old? Well, the game controls mostly the same, with similar combo setups and the same general objectives, skate big and get big scores. It also even has the classic 2-minute runs included in the game, but is it also trying to be something new, something more realistic? The nail a trick feature seems like they're trying to be more grounded, verging on controls that mirror the Skate franchise, though the first game in that series wouldn't release for another year. But it begs the question, which way is the series really trying to go at this point? And I think the answer was clearly every way possible. It seems like the team wanted a success and wanted to try and appeal to both longtime fans and new fans that wanted something different. So what you end up with is this end product that's been created from a soup of mechanics that don't mesh well on a design level or from a style perspective. While the skating has remained mostly the same, it's drastically changed in the way that it feels to play. There's a lot more weight in Project 8 to just about everything we do, and I think this is a huge reflection of how the series wants to be sort of taken seriously now. It wants to get to this other side of realism, where tricks and combos are a little bit harder to pull off, and every trick we do is stomped into the ground rather than landed into gracefully. But this makes everything more tedious, especially with just how slow we start out. It's a pain in the ass to do some of the things that the game wants us to, and getting our skills up is even a chore. We don't just have to complete objectives anymore, we actually have to grind or manual a certain amount to get those skills to increase. Grinding a ridiculous amount of feet before we gain another point in that attribute is just way too demanding for a skateboarding game that, at the end of the day, is supposed to be fun. And none of this even really touches upon the fact that Project 8 has a ton of performance issues. The game drops frames out of nowhere, probably because they tried to cram such a high fidelity open world into one game, and when we transition from area to area, the game actually has to load that stuff in real fast. The game also has this obsession with doing this picture-in-picture thing. It happens when we're filming a skate video. A smaller view of what the camera is actually shooting will be displayed in the corner, but it also happens during demos. The goal in demos is to impress the crowds around the skating area. We have to do tricks in front of different groups, but we can't neglect any of them or we'll lose. So we have to go back and forth, pulling off big combos at the 3 different areas. But when one group gets low on their impression meter, we get a little view of that specific crowd. Every time this picture-in-picture thing pops up, it just slows down the game drastically and makes it incredibly difficult to even pull off combos. It's insane how badly this actually affects the gameplay. And all of this works to create an absolute pile of problems that Project 8 has. It doesn't know what it wants to be, it performs poorly, and it tries to do everything and please everyone while making the whole thing a worse game in the process. Project 8 would actually improve sales a bit for the series, but it definitely hadn't returned to where it was in the past. This meant that Activision and Neversoft still couldn't quite reach those heights they had in the early 2000s, but they weren't done trying just yet. The next game in the Tony Hawk series would repeat a lot of the same mistakes as the previous entry, and that's going to lead to me talking about it for a bit less than Project 8. Tony Hawk's Proving Ground was released on October 16, 2007 in North America and November 2, 2007 in the EU for PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, and Xbox 360. Proving Ground sees us put in a classic situation, up-and-coming skater, blah blah blah. It's incredibly similar to Project 8 though, with far less stuff mucking up our map and vision constantly. We definitely aren't inundated with as many objectives to complete right off the bat, though I do think that's just about the only improvement that Proving Ground makes on the Project 8 formula. In just about every other way, this game is terrible. It tries to introduce a ton of new mechanics, a lot that also double down on the nail a trick mechanic from Project 8. These, like before, are a very watered down version of Skate that offers almost nothing in the way of actual challenge or interest. The game also introduces mechanics like the aggro push. With this, we can speed up incredibly fast by pushing hard on the ground. This is great for getting big air and pulling off huge moves, or even just getting to places faster, but it has to be timed right to be used at all. It's so annoying to have to try and use this when going for a trick or when going to somewhere far away. We're playing a fucking mini rhythm game every time we're skating around, and it just becomes so tedious and annoying. The game has no story worth really talking about. The skating is even worse than before. Proving Ground just straight up isn't fun, and its open goal system is sort of similar to Project 8, but it's a bit more focused, I guess. We have 3 paths to choose from, focusing on our career and sponsorships, focusing on aggro thrash type missions with Mike Valley, or focusing on rigging things up like placing ramps and rails so we can customize our lines. But this removes one of the only parts about Project 8 that I actually liked, which is the feeling of actually climbing the leaderboard and the freedom that that game offered you. It doesn't really feel like that exists here. It sometimes feels like Neversoft listens to fan response and then changes things in the worst way possible. Like, it seems like they heard people say, there's way too much shit in Project 8, so then they just took everything out and only gave you a few things to do and kept all of the other bad stuff. Focusing on one complaint doesn't recognize the 20 other things that Project 8 had going for it. And even if Project 8 wasn't my favorite, it still had some interesting aspects to it. There was some gold to be found beneath the mountain of dirt. Proving Ground has almost nothing as far as a silver lining goes. Even the levels are, across the board, poorly designed. There's barely any interesting lines, and the ones that are there are so simple they might as well have come from one of the PS1 titles. At least those games had some sort of excuse, but these people know how to tie a level in together. It probably just had something to do with being more grounded and realistic, but it just doesn't work here at all. Tony Hawk's Proving Ground would once again drop the sales for the series. Underperforming was becoming a trend for these games rather than the outlier. But the Tony Hawk franchise had not yet quite hit its death knell, because it wasn't going out without a gory, messy, sloppy, and desperate fight. Soon after a string of commercial failures, the Tony Hawk series would begin to enter the motion scene, attempting to recreate the feeling of skating in your hands or on your feet. Tony Hawk's Motion was released on the Nintendo DS on November 18, 2008 in North America, and on November 21, 2008 in the EU. I'm not going to talk too long about any of these peripheral games, mostly just because they were either really bad or they just weren't for me. Tony Hawk's Motion is a very simple DS game that sees you skating around a few different levels and pulling off tricks. It's mostly like the other entries in the series, but the cool new feature that this game has is that the control scheme is all fucked up. Motion came with a motion pack that would insert into the GBA slot on the DS, and it would allow you to use motion controls to steer your skater. This game controls awfully overall. The steering with the motion controls barely works. You use the left bumper to gain speed and the right bumper to jump, which both just feel awkward. The separate tricks in the game are just on all the different face buttons. It's terrible to interface with. On top of that, there really isn't a lot of content here to be found. There's only 4 levels and barely any modes. The levels themselves are incredibly bare bones, not having any really good lines or cohesive design between the objects. The whole game is just rough and is very clearly a ploy to try and access a bigger market with a gimmick. Tony Hawk's Motion would actually become one of the worst reviewed games in the series, with a Metacritic score of 39 out of 100. It also would not impress fans, leading to low sales overall. But the next game in the series would double down on that feeling of real-life motion. Have you ever wanted to just ride a skateboard? Maybe do some tricks? Maybe get really good at it and impress your friends? Well, thankfully, the next Tony Hawk game in the series would allow you to do that, but without having to leave your house. Tony Hawk's Ride was released for the PlayStation 3, Wii, and Xbox 360 on November 17, 2009 in North America and December 4, 2009 in the EU. Tony Hawk's Ride was the first game in the series to feature a full peripheral device that we use as a controller. No longer would fans of the series be forced to use a clunky controller. We can now actually stand on a board and skate in our living room. Tony Hawk's Ride was sold with a skateboard controller that had sensors on the sides. This board would sense your feet and movements, ideally allowing you to push to gain speed, flick the board up to ollie and do flip tricks, and even balance to manual. This board came out during the height of the peripheral era of video games, when Rock Band was just hitting its stride, when Guitar Hero had sort of started a downward trend, but that meant that everyone was trying to find their own peripherals. They wanted in on the action, and the Tony Hawk games were right there along with everyone else. Let's first talk about the Ride board. The board itself was a notorious failure as a peripheral. I remember trying this thing out once at a friend's house and we just couldn't get it to work. All that I ever heard about the board was that it just didn't work at all, and looking up reviews of the board led me to believe that I would be facing the same fate. Now, that wasn't really the case. Sure, I did have issues, yes, but the board mostly worked fine for me right from the get-go. The game forces you to calibrate the board before you begin playing, and this step was mostly painless aside from the lengthy interjections by Tony Hawk himself.
Okay, now make sure not to touch the board until the countdown ends. Don't worry, the sensors are perfectly safe. Those sensors are going to be super calibrated in a bit. This is probably the easiest thing you'll do all day. Almost there. Got it.
And when I started the game, it just kind of worked. I saw some videos online documenting people having a ton of issues with even ollieing or pulling off flip tricks, but it just worked for me mostly. There were some issues, like when I would ollie, most of the time it would also try to make me do an indie grab, and certain tricks that I would try would always be something else entirely. So it definitely wasn't working 100% as intended, but it was much better than I expected. Now, there are two modes of play in Ride. One where you're mostly on rails following a yellow line and all you worry about is pulling off the tricks. The other one lets you free roam. I knew the free roam was going to be bad, but I tried it for a few minutes anyways and immediately switched back. Getting your skater to accurately turn is god-awful. You have little to no control over this board and putting your character where you actually want them to be. The on-the-rails mode is much better overall, and I think it's honestly just what this game should have been focused on in the first place. This peripheral shouldn't have been a way to let you entirely recreate the Tony Hawk games from the ground up, but with a board, it should have just been a different type of experience that was catered around the board. Now, I will say that even though the board worked all right for me, that doesn't mean I actually like this game. It's fun for about the first few minutes, but you quickly realize that it's entirely opposed to the design philosophies of the previous games. It just doesn't really put fun at the forefront of the game. It's mostly focused on this board and getting you to interface with that rather than fun gameplay. Also, similar to Motion, the levels in this game really aren't great. There's not a lot of good design put into them. It's sort of this half-baked idea that feels, again, more like a product than a game. There's also these weird, corny video messages you get from Tony Hawk and different skaters where they're on these terrible green screens and just are failing to even deliver the simplest lines.
Can you believe it? This skater just turned pro, and now look where we're at. This is a true Cinderella story.
Ooh-wee, you are fast. You should try your skills at a different session type.
This was probably the most entertaining part of the game, though, to be honest. Ride would be panned by critics and fans alike. It did not sell well at all, but that wouldn't stop Robomoto and Activision from making another game with this board. Before they abandoned the peripheral entirely, Activision and Robomoto would make one more attempt at making this whole skateboarding peripheral thing work. Tony Hawk's Shred was released for PlayStation 3, Wii, and Xbox 360 on October 26, 2010 in North America and October 29, 2010 in the EU. Shred was very similar to Ride in that it used this peripheral board to allow you to play. And the controls and calibration were mostly the same, except Tony Hawk interjects just a little less here.
Now make sure not to touch the board until the countdown ends. Here we go. Just a little bit more. Not too much longer.
Okay, maybe I was wrong. Maybe the awkward silence makes things worse. At least we don't have Tony Hawk on a green screen this time around making strange comments. Oh, wait.
Let's see how many stars you have. Wow, I'll take that as a good sign.
Activision actually released another board for Shred, but you could still use the Ride board if you already had that. Shred was a bit more focused on delivering an on-rails experience than Ride was. Most of the game sees us skating lines that keep us going in one direction. There are a load of different challenges here for us to complete that will give us the ability to progress, get the highest score, complete the run the fastest, etc., etc. But Shred just feels a bit better all around. It seems to have taken the failures of the first game and just tried to fix them as best as it could. There isn't much to say here about Shred that I didn't already say about Ride, but I will say that this game is a bit of a step up. I still can't exactly get on the skateboarding controller train, but I do think they at least made an effort to fix some of the things in the second entry. The levels are also a bit better designed, which is always a plus. Shred still did not see any of the success that the series had been searching for, and this would mark a particular low point in the series' history. But don't worry, it gets much worse from here. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD was released in 2012 for Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Windows. It was the second attempt at remaking the first two games in the series and bringing them up to modern consoles. The first attempt at this was actually on the Xbox with a game called Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2X. I tried to play this game, but for some reason I couldn't get it running on any emulator. The basic thing that it does is remake the first and second game with the modern controls of the Pro Skater series, but not really. Not all of the levels from those games are actually present here, just a few chosen ones from each entry. They also have an expanded goal list for the levels from the first game, giving you more to do in those levels. The game obviously has a bit of a facelift in the graphics department, and it is nice to skate around these parks while being able to manual and wall plant, but that's about where my praise for these remakes end. First of all, they just really failed to nail down the controls for the game overall. It doesn't feel as good to skate here as Underground, Underground 2, or even American Wasteland. Everything is a bit too chunky and just doesn't feel smooth at all. On top of that, the entire moveset isn't even present. We actually can't revert in the base game. That ability and skill is just not present here at all. You could buy the ability to revert with real life money, as it was released as a DLC after the initial launch of the game, but Jesus, talk about stingy. On top of that, the overall design of the game is just god-awful. I mean, look at this UI. Look at these menus. This just screams low-effort cash grab to me. It looks terrible, it doesn't really play well, it's just not really good overall. This is probably why it was delisted from storefronts in 2017, but I don't think it was ever really worth it. Luckily, Activision would manage to actually put out a great remake of the first two games further down the line. But before we can get to that, we have one final, genuine Pro Skater game left to talk about. Oh boy, this one is a doozy. With the series on a massive downward trend, clearly there was a need to get the Tony Hawk games back on top. So what better way to do this than to revive the Pro Skater subtitle and make one more game in that classic series that everyone loved. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was released for PlayStation 4 and Xbox One on September 29, 2015 in North America and on October 2, 2015 in the EU. Since Pro Skater 5 is the first mainline entry in the Pro Skater series since the 4th entry, we can directly compare it with that game. And it's actually basically the same as that game if you downgraded Pro Skater 4 in every single way. It has the same general structure though, sort of. We have open areas that we can skate and explore with no time limit, and we move around to waypoints and complete objectives given to us. Let's start with the mechanics. I didn't actually think it was possible for the series to move backwards, but somehow Pro Skater 5 actually downgrades the skating and mechanics. Mostly everything is the same as previous games when it comes to skating, except for one large void in that of special tricks. We no longer do inputs to pull off special tricks. Now we just fill a meter and we activate a special mode where those tricks are pulled off automatically. If we do a flip trick in special mode, it becomes a special flip trick. If we do a grab trick, it becomes a special grab, and so on and so forth. This is the worst because it just completely removes that aspect of the game. Why have the player input the buttons when the game can just do it for you? It's not like special tricks were difficult to pull off or anything, but why remove that part of the challenge anyways? Also, it prevents us from using as many special tricks as we want because we can only special trick when the meter is full. When it comes to levels, Pro Skater 5 is an absolute insult to the series. Most of the levels are just terrible, especially the beginning skate park that we start in. First of all, they are incredibly small, lacking any considerable lines for us to skate. The lines that we can skate are shockingly simplistic, leaving Pro Skater 5 feeling like a mobile game rather than a full-fledged sequel to the Pro Skater series. They even had the audacity to make a level titled School 3, which is easily the worst of the school levels, and most of which is just a gross ripoff of School 2. Then we have the goals, or objectives, in each level. They didn't even try to put NPCs in here to give the game some semblance of life this time around. All of the goals are just randomly placed GPS pings on the stage. We approach them and hold a button, and suddenly we're in some random-ass challenge that has no style or substance. We're destroying drones in the air, we're trying to push big balls out of a pool. Like, what the fuck is this? And the game has absolutely no environmental storytelling whatsoever. We can't affect the environment in any way. We can't destroy pieces of the map to change the skating area. We can't open up new spots. It's all just there, and it's all just bland. Pro Skater 5 represents possibly the most watered down version of the series that's possible, and I can understand some people not liking the wacky destruction hijinks era that reached full force around Underground 2, but going this far in the opposite direction just leaves so much to be desired. This isn't even a Tony Hawk game, it's just nothing. The game is so boring and lifeless that it feels like way more of a product than any other game in the series has. Hell, I hated Proving Ground, but at least I felt like it was trying something. It wasn't something that I particularly enjoyed, but it was something. This is just reviving a dead series because you can, because you have the ability, not because you think you can actually make a good game with it. Pro Skater 5 also placed a heavy focus on its multiplayer aspects, encouraging people to play the game in online modes with their friends or in random lobbies. None of that seemed to really matter though, because even if you expected the first numbered sequel to the Pro Skater series in 13 years to make a big splash, it did anything but that. It was one of the worst selling entries in the series to date, and the Tony Hawk franchise went on a hiatus for another 5 years before we would finally get to end this whole thing on a high note. In 2015, the rights to the Tony Hawk series actually expired, leaving any sort of interest in reviving this dead franchise to the dust. But this wouldn't last too long because shortly, skateboarding's popularity would be on the rise once again, and Activision was looking to capitalize on this. They gave this task to developer Vicarious Visions, who had worked on some Tony Hawk ports in the faraway past. This game would not be something entirely new, but would seek to remaster the first two games in the series, Pro Skater 1 and 2. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1+2 was released for PlayStation 4, Windows, and Xbox One on September 4th, 2020. Now, I have to say that Pro Skater 1 and 2 is one of the best Tony Hawk games that we've gotten in years. It's a fantastic remake that feels faithful to the original games while incorporating most of the elements from the later entries that fans enjoyed. I have played Pro Skater 1 and 2 so many times since its release. I've beaten it multiple times on PS4, PS5, and PC. It's just such a fantastic game with massive amounts of replayability, and it's easily the best remake that the series has ever seen. The game contains all of the original levels from the first 2 games in the series. Each level has expanded goal sets that are somewhat shared with the previous remakes that the series saw. Vicarious Visions, of course, did put in their own additions to the game in the form of collectibles, secrets, and simple goals. With this entry, we're back to the classic 2-minute trial format, completing goals in this short time and crossing them off our list. The game does add in the floating skill points from Pro Skater 3 though, so upgrading our character is as easy as collecting these skill points from each level and applying them. We have access to basically the entire moveset from the later games. We can manual, wall plant, revert. The only thing we can't really do is get off our board, which overall was probably a good choice in the long run. The original Pro Skater levels weren't designed to be walked around in, they were designed to be skated, so I'm mostly fine with leaving that off the table. And running through both of these games, getting all of the goals and the gold medals is just so damn fun, but it's all of the other things that we can do past that make this game a real treat. There's an online mode with a ton of different ways to challenge off against others. There's a breadth of created parks that we can skate. We can make our own parks and upload them online for others to see. We can even collect all of the Vicarious Visions logos in the game, one in each level. There's also a secret collectible set of alien plushies that we can collect to unlock the alien skater. The game is just so well done, there's almost nothing wrong with it. The skating isn't too floaty or too weighty, it's not trying to make these games something that they weren't, it really just feels like it took those original 2 entries and added in the reverts and the manuals, gave the levels a facelift, added some challenge for the veterans to complete, and called it a day. And it might seem like a quick run through, but completing all of the challenges in the game will see you playing Pro Skater 1 and 2 for 40 plus hours easily. It's so much fun if you're willing to dive deep into its newer systems and give it some of your time. It's honestly a shame because the game did really well, and it seemed like a no-brainer that we would get a Pro Skater 3 and 4 remaster next, but because Vicarious Visions was a subsidiary of Activision, they were eventually merged into Blizzard. This left Activision to look for third-party teams that could make the next entry, but they felt like no one could really live up to the team at Vicarious Visions, and they left that idea in the trash. Honestly though, I'd rather get nothing than another bad game in this series, because at this point, the series has kind of ended on a high note, and after years and years of terrible failures, I feel like the fans of the Tony Hawk series kind of deserved that one. The Tony Hawk series has some really great games that I devoted a lot of my early gaming life to, games that I spent dozens, if not hundreds of hours playing. These games were so well crafted that they took the market by storm, and for a while, people couldn't stop buying them. But this was never meant to last. With the popularity of skateboarding on the decline, and the market looking for newer, more realistic ways to play skateboarding in video games, the Tony Hawk series was on its way out. But that didn't stop different developers from trying to recapture that magic in some form. And honestly, the Tony Hawk series was sort of a piece of the time. It really couldn't have been made in any other way, at any other time, and the series did need to evolve. If it didn't, we would have never gotten Underground, but it wasn't meant to last forever. It wasn't meant to be this annual series that we'd have 20 years later, still releasing with slight upgrades. I do wish that we could have gotten those remakes from Vicarious Visions, but the Tony Hawk series is definitely left better in the past. We've already had years of dragging it up over and over to try and get that magic back. We probably don't need to do that again. Until next time, bye now.